If everyone's had a chance to look over some of the housekeeping rules there, the main important one is just that you're all muted or should be muted at the minute. If you could just stay muted during the session, that would be great.
Excellent. So welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for tuning in and coming to this webinar series. So my name is Nancy Kula from the University of Essex, and I'm really happy to have all of you joining from different parts of the world, a very sort of nice international audience. So the webinar series is stemming from a project that we have with colleagues at the University of Essex. So Hannah Gibson, Tracy Costley, and our postdoc Colin Riley. And we are working on a project that is thinking about multilingual classroom learning. So the clue is in our short title of our project, which is called Bringing the Outside In. We are interested in looking at communities in the Global South for us, in particular in Botswana, in Tanzania, and in Zambia, and noticing that the communities in these three countries are fairly multilingual, but the kinds of language policies that they have, or language and education policies, are very monolingual. So we're interested in seeing what interplay is there between the community context and what's going on in the classroom. So on the one hand, we want to see, are the classrooms really monolingual, as the policies say, or are they actually multilingual? And then the other part of it is to say, actually, it would be nice to enhance the classroom so that they were more multilingual, thinking about the idea of translanguaging as a way of trying to get more students to have access to education so that no one whose language is not used is not disadvantaged in any way. So this is sort of stemming from, and our project is funded by the British Academy as part of the Global Challenges research funding schemes that are sort of going around. And so we thought, knowing that there are many of these projects going along, focusing on the sort of Global South, we thought it might be nice to sort of talk to other people who are working on projects to do with language. So there are many languages and the focus is always on, there are many projects and the focus is always on sustainable development, and there are areas in development, in politics, in health, in economics, in all kinds of different areas. But we thought it might be nice to bring together all the work which is to do with language and linguistics to a certain extent, to see whether there could be synergies we could draw across the different findings, to see whether also we could actually share practice. So it's really interesting, this North-South divide, and working with colleagues in the South is a very important part of the projects. Therefore, we were really interested in sort of knowing and finding out, is there some sort of practice that we could sort of learn from each other, apart from also what the findings are likely to be. So we thought it might be a nice idea to have these webinars, and we're very happy and sort of thankful to our speakers, all of them in the series, who have sort of accepted to give talks within this series. So at the moment, we've got 5 talks that are scheduled, and then we have a sort of a final session where we are going to have a panel discussion to sort of bring together what are the ideas that are kind of emerging. So their talks are going to be sort of differently focused. We hope that for most of the talks, they're also going to be speakers from the Global South in the different areas that people are working in. So just a reminder that we should keep our microphones on mute, because so that there shouldn't be any interference. And then with the questions, the question and answer session, we are going to do that through the chat room, so you can post your questions. In fact, even as somebody's speaking, if you feel something comes up that you'd like to ask, then just pop it into the chat room, and then Colin will keep an eye on that later on, and then we can have a nice question and answer session. The talk is going to be about 30 minutes long, and then we sort of go into questions. So I'll just hand over to Colin now to welcome our speakers for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. It's great to see so many people here for the first exciting talk in our webinar series. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome our 2 speakers. Dr. Veena Tesur is a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies at Dublin City University. She holds a Caroline Fellowship, and she's the principal researcher on the project Translation as Empowerment, Translation as a Contributor to Human Rights in the Global South. She was previously a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Reading on the AHRC-funded The Listing Zones of NGOs, Languages and Cultural Knowledge in Development Programmes project. Dr. Anita Friel is Head of Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning at GOAL, Irish humanitarian NGO. and she has over 20 years of experience working within humanitarian and development contexts with a variety of international NGOs and the United Nations. The talk today is on translation as empowerment, languages, sustainable development, and academic NGO collaboration. And with that, I'll hand over to our speakers, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Colin, and for inviting us. I'm really delighted to be able to do this talk. And I think it's nice to be able to meet other academics in this way online while we haven't really seen anyone from our universities in a few months. So I'm just going to try to share my screen. Yeah, that should work, I hope. And then start the slideshow. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was introduction, so I guess I'll be able to go through that quite quickly. So I've been working as a postdoctoral fellow at Dublin City University since last June, and I've started collaborating more closely with GOAL in October when I started doing an internship or a secondment in their offices in Dublin. And the project that we're working on is running for 2 years, so we're about midway now. The talk today, I'm mainly going to focus on academic and NGO collaboration. Anita will come in later in the talk as well to talk a bit more about GOAL and what it does and how it's involved in the project. But then in the question and answer session, if you have more questions about the project itself, the focus of the research and so on, then obviously we can talk about that. So Colin's already introduced me. The other thing I wanted to add to that is before I joined the listening project that he mentioned, I also did a PhD, which was on Amnesty International, which means that I've worked with quite a range of NGOs over the years. And I also wanted to add that Anita is my mentor that I'm working with in GOAL, but I also have a mentor at Dublin City University, which is Professor Sharon O'Brien. Some of you might have come across her name and her work because she's recently led a major project on crisis translation, which my topic relates to as well, since my project is about how NGOs deal with language challenges and translation challenges. I'll let Anita add anything else she wants to her introduction. Anita, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Weena, and thanks everybody. It's quite an interesting audience for me, very unusual. So forgive me for not being a linguistic. I'm a medical doctor by training with a master's in public health and a diploma on reproductive health and infectious disease and tropical medicine. I have worked for over 20 years in various humanitarian development contexts across mostly Africa, Balkans and Southeast Asia. My own, interest on early research was on quality of maternal health services, actually in Albania, where I'm from. And then more recently on evaluation of public health advocacy, disability inclusion in development, and results-based management in development. And we're delighted. I've been with GOAL for 1 year, although GOAL has been one of my first postings, internationally. As a young, medical doctor, that gave me the opportunity to work in Africa for the first time, actually in Angola, 20 years ago. So it's kind of like, I've come back home, I call it, after having done, work with various organizations, including Oxfam for a significant amount of time. And, in the GOAL, in my team, the monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning team, we host Weena and this particular research that she's leading on. But we will talk more about that, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Anita. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to talk a bit more about the actual fellowship that I have and the way that it's structured so that you can better understand how the collaboration is developing. So it's a Marie Curie co-fund fellowship that I have, which is part of a strand that's called Carolyn, and that stands for Collaborative Research Fellowships for a responsive and innovative Europe. So it's co-funded by the Irish Research Council, and it's set out specifically to fund experienced researchers from any discipline to conduct research that is relevant to the themes of the United Nations 2030 Agenda or Sustainable Development Goals. So the approach that I've taken to that, because then you need to do your proposal and you need to make clear why your research matters to this team. So all of my research has been about the role of languages in international NGOs, how NGOs manage to communicate with local communities, and what role translation plays in that. So in my proposal, I argued that the Sustainable Development Goals aim to leave no one behind. Very important agents in delivering the Sustainable Development Goals are considered to be international NGOs who position themselves and are encouraged to work in partnership with local organizations and with local communities. But as many of you are probably aware, since many of you are working on language and development, the SDGs don't mention the role of languages anywhere. And so that's a theme that I picked up. And I just added this, this URL there to a website from the Languages in the UN Working Group, which some of you might be aware of, some of you might not be. But they've hosted a number of conferences at the United Nations, talking about the role of languages, vulnerable populations, and the SDGs. And it's quite a useful website because they've got all the reports and so on there. So that might be something to look at if you are interested in this topic. So in terms of my specific project, I was interested in understanding what role translation can play to ensure this equal dialogue that NGOs tend to speak of. How do you create an equal dialogue between international NGOs and local communities and partners that speak different languages? So how can translation be used as a tool that provides access to information and as a tool that enables people to be heard? So this is why I've proposed this title of Translation as Empowerment. So in terms of the collaboration, Carolyn is not specifically encouraging collaboration between the Global North and the Global South. So when Colin first invited me, I actually said, you do know that I'm not actually working with a partner from the Global South. Obviously, I am working with GOAL, who has 13 programs in different countries all around the globe. So I am working with them, and from the very beginning I've also made sure that I incorporated in my research design a stage to do ethnographic fieldwork in one of GOAL's country programs. So that would be my take on how I'm trying to bring that in. So a key feature of Carolyn is collaboration between the academic sector and the non-academic sector, so NGOs or other types of international organizations. So how did I get in touch with GOAL, and how did this research project come about? I already had a draft proposal because I had been applying for other grants, as we do as postdoctoral researchers. So I already had an idea, and I approached GOAL through colleagues from DCU that had connections with the NGOs. Very briefly, with a short email, a one-page document saying, this is the idea, this is what I want to do, are you interested, or can we work on this? And that's how it developed. And the ideas that I had of focusing on translation as a positive tool that could encourage access to information and voices to be heard, that was based on the previous research that I've done. So what I want to do here is just briefly talk about those previous collaborations and kind of see what they have in common and how I have actually managed to work with all these NGOs in these nine years of my research career. So when I started my PhD, this was a part of another EU-funded Marie Curie project, an international training network that specifically was focused on translation research training. So training postdoctoral researchers on doing research on translation. And one of the partner organizations in that project, because we all had to do secondment as doctoral fellows, we had to be seconded for a number of months to non-academic partners to learn other types of skills. And one of the partners in the project was Amnesty International. In a very similar way as the relationship with Goal, that partnership with Amnesty started through personal networks. So I ended up doing an institutional ethnography with Amnesty in 3 of their offices, in Antwerp, in Madrid, and in Paris. And I focused on the way that they were organizing translation, both on a global organizational level. For French, Spanish, and Arabic, for example, they have internal translation teams, professional translators, they do terminology, management, and so on. Whereas for smaller languages like Dutch, which is my mother tongue, they don't really do that, and it's much more organic. It's the local office that will decide how translation happens. So I studied how they were organizing that and what effects that actually had on the translations that they were producing in terms of quality and so on. And then I went on to be a postdoctoral fellow on this Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project called the Listening Zones of NGOs. Where we worked with 4 large UK-based NGOs, Tear Fund, Save the Children, Christian Aid, and Oxfam GB. So how did that partnership come about? In this case, the critical factor, I think, was the fact that we were working with INTRAC, which is an international NGO training and research center based in Oxford. And they were our official partner in this project. And they were the ones who had all of the links with the NGOs. So they helped us to get in touch with people from these 4 NGOs, to have them write letters for support, to support our research bid, and so on. And that's how that developed. So how to engage with NGOs and what sort of arguments could you put forward to them on why language is important to their work? So for Amnesty, I would say that a large part of their interest in language and in translation comes from the fact that they are working with legal human rights terminology. So translation quality is really important. The way that specific terminology is translated is really important because it can have significant consequences in terms of reputational risk for the organization, but also it could put people's life in more danger if there are any issues around that, because it might entice more conflict, for example. Also, in the case of Amnesty, they have a worldwide movement with a network of volunteers that also do translations. So that's part of the work I was doing in the office in Antwerp, was to look at how they were working with the volunteers and giving the staff in Amnesty more guidance on how to improve their processes and improve translation quality. For the development NGOs that we worked with in the Listening Zones project, our starting point was the fact that NGOs position themselves as listening to local communities. And we wondered, how do you do this listening if actually you don't really have a language policy and a lot of your work is being done in English? So how do you manage to do that? We've also really tried to engage in debates with the aid sector in terms of the emphasis on accountability to not just to financial donors, but accountability to the local communities, and also what the role of language is in light of safeguarding. And as you probably know, safeguarding issues have been a real concern over the last few years with scandals in Oxfam and Save the Children, for example. So that's how we were trying to connect with these NGOs and raise awareness of the role that languages play. Another project I wanted to mention is the one that's been led by my DCU mentor, Professor Sharon O'Brien. So this project was more focused on crisis translation and engaged with some humanitarian NGOs, where the argument that they put forward with their colleagues was that timely and accurate information is important in a crisis. Think of what's been happening with COVID. We've received so much health information, so many guidelines on how to behave, wearing face masks and social distancing and so on. But translation is generally overlooked in disaster preparedness planning and also in research. There's very little research on this up until now. And this is difficult because organizations like Translators Without Borders, who were also a partner in this specific Interact project, for example, have been raising awareness that translating concepts such as social distancing in other languages is very difficult because it might culturally not make much sense. So that's another reason why we should be thinking about translation, because it can really have an impact on people's lives. So overall, I think all of these projects, they draw attention to the gaps that exist in current policy and practice within the aid sector, not just in NGOs, but also from donors, on the importance of language and translation, which is generally not thought about. And like I said, it doesn't tend to be taken into account in planning or in budgets. And it can lead to poor practice and negative impacts on people's lives. My personal point of view is that translation are very often seen as an administrative cost in these projects. And that's a problem because donors are often not open to funding admin costs, or only to a very low degree. So it's my personal view that they should become a core element of NGOs projects because they can ensure that their interventions are more successful. It's one factor at least that can deliver better results. So what I wanted to do in my collaboration with Goal is to find ways to show that translation can make a positive difference, because it was quite easy to collect data on why language is a problem and where a language is a barrier, but it's much more difficult to show that translation actually can make a positive difference. So that's where I hand over to Anita and let her tell you a bit more about Goal.
So I'll share my screen, Weena, so that the subtitling can work. Okay, you can see my screen? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just to say a few words about Goal, the organization, what we do, where we are, and you know, how we do what we do. So it's an international humanitarian response agency established in Ireland over 40 years ago. Our mission is to work with the most vulnerable communities to help them. To help them recover, to help them respond and recover from humanitarian crisis, and assist them building transcendent solutions to mitigate poverty and vulnerability. So while we are, you know, in the main humanitarian response agency, we also take people, if you like, or accompany people. And when I say people, this is, you know, very vulnerable, extremely poor, extremely, you know, discriminated, forgotten about, I suppose, you know, communities, because we do work in the very, in the most fragile context around the world, and I'll mention, you know, where they are, but we accompany them from, I suppose, surviving crisis to then, you know, building resilience to then, you know, long-term development goals. We do deliver a range of humanitarian and development programs with a focus on systems, partnerships, and building resilience. And our areas of work are, we have around 4 goals, 4 programmatic goals. So people survive crisis, so that's, you know, encompasses our humanitarian response. People have resilient health. So health is a huge, you know, it has always been, you know, certainly the humanitarian, you know, imperative, but also health has been a huge response and part of what Goal is and part of Goal identities. I mean, hence I joined Goal, you know, 20 years ago as a medical doctor, moving more, you know, gradually to public health as time went on. Also, another big area of Goal is nutrition and food security. And then I suppose our 4th goal is people have sustainable livelihoods. So you can see that continuum, I suppose, that we take people along. But it's not just about, I suppose, providing services, you know, and responding to needs, but it's also about working with the systems where people and the communities that we work with are. So looking at, be they the sort of the formal systems, so the local, national, you know, governments, the other civil society that is there, if it is there, the international community, looking at policy and legislation that is impacting and the underlying causes, you know, that is impacting on the communities that we work with, whether it's a crisis that you're dealing with, or whether it's a food security or a nutrition or a health, you know, crisis, or a you know, a livelihoods building issue. In terms of, you know, geography, so we are in 3 regions of the world, in Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, in 13 countries. So in Africa, we would be in countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, Niger, Uganda, Sudan, South Sudan. In the Middle East, we would be in Syria, and Syria, in fact, would be our biggest, you know, program that we have. It's nearly half of what we do, really. You know, it's Syria, and we respond. In particular, we are in the northwestern Syria, in Idlib and Aleppo, and we are the only international, you know, organization present there, working with securing, I suppose, access to water, access to food, you know, shelter, really kind of keeping people alive, you know, and about 1.2 million people. That's kind of my job, you know. My team's job is to, you know, collect data of, you know, who do we reach, and obviously how are we doing. Also in Middle East, we are in Turkey and Iraq. So, but it's very much around the Syrian humanitarian crisis. And then in Latin America, we work in Haiti and Honduras. So we do, I suppose, why is it then this partnership with this particular project? Because you think we're a mainstream organization, the research, you know, maybe should be, and we do research very much on other areas, right? On, you know, working in fragile states, or working in health and nutrition, in, you know, markets for livelihoods, food security, and so on. I mean, first of all, to say that goal traditionally has always, even 20 years ago when I worked with goal, there was a strong focus on delivering, you know, results. So having an impact, but also learning from what we're doing and what others are doing. And how do you do that? One element, of course, is research, you know. And over time, I mean, goal has developed excellent, you know, academic partnerships, not only in Ireland, such as, you know, with DCU, Dublin City University, where, you know, WINA's research comes from, but also with other universities in Ireland, so Trinity College, University College Dublin, UCD, TCD. And by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, I did hold assistant professorship, adjunct assistant professorship with Trinity College for about 5 years, teaching there on epidemiology and supervising master students. And you know, but you know, more recently with this job, I had let that one go for a while. But I mean, you know, regardless of, you know, myself, as I said, there has always been that, you know, tradition of working with academia, and we have, you know, goal has managed to have, you know, peer-reviewed, you know, published research on nutrition, health, resilience, you know, various areas. We also, you know, as I said, we are in 13 countries, and we are a large organization with 2,500 staff across the world, speaking, you know, many languages. And in fact, you know, WINA did a survey recently with a number of staff based at HQ in Dublin, but also across some of our offices. And she could tell you more about, you know, how many languages, you know, she found out that, you know, we speak. But it's not just about the languages that our staff speaks, but also then you have all the languages that our communities speak, then the languages that our partners and various, you know, stakeholders speak. So of course, you know, if you want to, and, you know, we have a strong focus on inclusion, and we do believe that you cannot have full inclusion without language inclusion. We also believe, I suppose, that diversity, working, you know, with such, you know, such diverse staff and communities brings challenges, but brings opportunities as well. So I suppose the research, that Weena leads, translation as empowerment, is about, looking at, okay, what richness is out there, but how to use that, to improve inclusion, for all, certainly for our communities and stakeholders and partners, but also, for our staff. But also while you're looking at the richness, also then what gaps are there, and how can you, what can we do, together as an NGO ourselves, but also in partnership with academia and, specialist linguistics to fill those gaps. So the research itself that Weena has, and I'm sure she can tell you more about it, it investigates a critical role that translation has in establishing this equal and two-way dialogue between NGOs and the people we work with in the Global South. So it comes from that strong belief that we have as an international organization, that we are equal or at least we try, to be equal with the people we work with. And, language, it is one of those elements that contribute, to that, effort, to be equal. It considers translation as a way to empower, communities as well, and as a tool that provides access, to information. Yeah. So I think I'll leave it there, Weena, and then maybe you continue more around the challenges and opportunities of collaborating between academia and partnership, and then we can. Obviously, we'll have time for questions more, either specifically of our own partnership between, DCU and the goal, but also the research, that we're conducting.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll stop
Yeah,
share.
so, okay, thank you. So, I'll put this back up. Okay. Yeah, so the only slides really that I have left now are about the challenges and opportunities of collaboration. And maybe before I go into that, I'll tell you a bit more about what we've actually been doing for the last year, and also how COVID is messing up some of what I had envisaged I was going to do. So my fellowship officially started last June, but I started working with GOAL in October. So I've been with GOAL in the office working with the NEDIS team, with the MEAL team, from October until February, March, when we went into lockdown. So during that time, I did the survey that Anita mentioned on language skills that was sent out widely across the organization. So it was quite a brief survey in which I was aiming to map what kind of language skills staff actually have and how they are using them on the job and how much time they're spending doing that sort of work. Because this type of informal translation work is usually not part of job descriptions, but people are doing it. So it was a way to make visible all that important work that is happening. Next to that, I've been interviewing staff as well about their experiences to have more in-depth views on that. And then just being in the office, talking to everyone, experiences on translation, which has triggered a lot of conversations about the use of machine translation, like Google Translate, for example, and what the challenges are with that, and so on. The idea was that from June onwards, I would go to work with a team in Honduras for 3 months. More closely there with the team, really looking at how GOAL is working with communities and how language fits in there. But obviously, I haven't been able to do that, and we're uncertain at this point if I'm still going to be able to. So we might reshape the research, and we're kind of thinking about that at the moment. So other challenges apart from COVID, I think just sort of thinking in general, there's 2 articles here that I'm referring to. One is an article that I wrote with a few, with the fellows that I did my PhD with on being seconded as a translation researcher to a non-academic partner, NGOs or industry. And then the Stevens article is an article specifically about academic and NGO collaboration. So the first challenge is, how do I find a partner? So in many of my cases, it's been through my own networks, but in some cases, like with the Caroline Fellowship, there was actually a webpage on the IRC website where NGOs that were interested in having a fellow working with them could register their interest. So that's very helpful to find each other. And I'm sure that other schemes would have similar things. Another challenge is the time that is needed to prepare the proposal, especially if you really want to co-design it. So my case is a bit different because it's my fellowship and it's my project and I'm the main person in charge. But if you do want to do it more collaboratively, you're going to need a lot of time to figure out the different roles and to write all the sections of the grant and so on. Accommodating different timescales and different type of outputs. So I wanted to write a monograph, but for goal, it's not so interesting to have to wait for 2 or 3 years to see some of the results of the research in a book. So we've talked about that, and then we've kind of changed the plan to go with shorter research articles that can also be useful for practitioners as a direct outcome of the research. And another ongoing challenge, I would say, is establishing trust and understanding each other's role. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A session if you have questions about that. And I think actually I'll stop it there. I had some more positives of the collaboration, but I've kind of touched on those. And I'm conscious that the time is getting short and I do want to have some time for questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah. Thank you very much for being here. And I really look forward to hearing some of your questions and what you want to know more about.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that talk. It was very interesting. So now, just to open the floor up for questions. So if anyone has a question, could you use the chat box? So if you just type your question in there, then everyone can see it and I'll read it out for our presenters. I have had one question sent to me, which is, are there any examples of NGOs successfully working with languages spoken by fewer people? So languages with, say, less than 1 million speakers or less than 100,000 speakers, if either of you are aware of any of those contexts.
That's a very challenging question. I would think there are definitely organizations working in the Global South, probably more with a national focus or local focus that are doing that. I don't know so much for international NGOs. There's organizations like SIL International, which you might know, who are the ones who've designed the Ethnologue website where you can find information about all the languages around the world. And I know that they are very much involved in producing tools and educational material as well, I think, in languages that are not widely spoken. But I wouldn't know in terms of the traditional sort of NGOs, like Goal is one, that are working on development and humanitarian aid. I wouldn't really be able to give you examples like that off the top of my head.
But if I could add there, I mean, this is interesting because this is something that Wina, if you were to go, the plan was for Wina to go to Honduras, or maybe you could say something of what we had talked about, that particular, ethnic group that you were going to look into.
That's true. And actually, while I'm saying I wouldn't know, it's even more evidence that this sort of stuff is happening. I'm not saying that all these NGOs are only communicating in English or in Spanish and not in any local languages. They are doing that. It's just that it doesn't really tend to be described in their practice, and it doesn't tend to be described in research. So that's what makes it difficult to answer the question. But like Anita says, for example, Goal in Honduras, it's working in some very remote areas like Mosquito, where Mosquito is spoken, indigenous areas closer to the seaside. And from what I have heard from the team and from people who have been there, is that the Goal is very much communicating in Mosquito there. For example, now in the COVID situation, they've been translating health information into Mosquito as well. So definitely organizations are doing that. It's just that it's not really documented at the moment.
So, as you sort of alluded to there, Weena, we have a few people from SIL in the session, so they have confirmed in the chat that they do the sort of work working with sort of language communities with smaller numbers of speakers. Another question we have, a few people may join the presentation a bit late, but just asking about your work or any work you've done engaging with Translators Without Borders.
Yes, so I haven't worked with them in a sort of collaborative way. I haven't been involved in a project where they've been a partner, but I've definitely come across them several times. I've had many conversations with them. I've published 2 articles actually, which were sort of interviews with them to understand better how they work. But they have been really closely involved in the crisis translation project that I mentioned, that was led by my mentor, Professor Sharon O'Brien. And in that case, they really have been working collaboratively, analyzing data together and so on. And they've done quite a lot of work on use of machine translation, also plain language principles, and other things like the use of social media and tweets in crisis situations and so on. I think Translators Without Borders, even though it started off as a voluntary organization to produce translations, the last few years, firstly, they've grown a lot. And secondly, they've started to get involved themselves in research much more. And I think they're one of the only organizations that really have data to show where translation is a problem, and that shows that by using certain guidelines, you could be improving your practice. So I think they're very interesting to look at. In terms of Goal has said on a number of occasions that they'd be interested in working with Translators Without Borders in some capacity, but that is something that we would need to look into how that would work, because it's not like Translators Without Borders is just going to provide free translations for all the international NGOs. That's not what they're trying to do. But in terms of doing some joint research, I think there would definitely be space for that.
Right, thanks. We have a whole bunch of questions coming in, so we'll try to get through them all. I've had a couple focusing more about collaboration that you did discuss during the presentation. One aspect about establishing trust. So that question is just asking how that's gone for you, establishing trust with partners. And then a follow-up question, a related question, is could you throw more light on how you actually convince a potential partner to get involved in work like this?
Yeah, I wonder if Anita wants to say something first about the trust thing, because I don't want to dominate the whole conversation.
Okay.
Sure, yeah, I mean, we and I were actually talking about this, it's very important, I don't know if we touched on this or not, that suddenly the relationship is governed by an MOU or an agreement or terms of reference, whatever, that is. In our case, it's governed by the Memorandum of Understanding. Is that correct, Weena? And it's very clear, yes. It sets very clearly the parameters of, how you, build and how you work with each other, essentially. What are you what are you allowed to do, so to speak, or not? But having said that, I think that's good, because if you have any issues, you can refer back to the MOU. So it's very important to have that, absolutely, and to be very clear, be very familiar with it. It's not just a tick box exercise, right, that you just sign and forget about it. But I think it's the human relationships that are very important, to build them. And I say this, to be honest, not in this context, but in anything. I mean, things get, with, I suppose, 20 plus years of working, in development and humanitarian context, things get done not necessarily because of the contracts that you sign. Things get done because of the relationship you build. So I think I have to hand it over to Weena that, we have, yes, we had that, but also, we have built that relationship so that when issues have arisen, then, you have that trust that everybody means well. There is mutual respect, there is space to actually talk about hard, and difficult things, that they're not just left there, festering, or that it has to be solved as, based on the MOU. So, and how do you achieve that? I think just by talking, you know, and being open and being transparent and finding the common ground, you know, despite all the challenges that are out there, that sometimes, you know, we talk different languages, even, you know, between NGOs and academics. There are different, you know, different goals, different, you know, outcomes, different time frames. But if you go back to, okay, why is it that we're working together? What's the common good here? Then I think that helps, you know, to build a relationship and then eventually build the trust. But, you know, what do you think, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really important idea that both of us are working towards similar goals. So it's my belief that access to information and ensuring that people can have their say is really important. And that stems from the idea that these organizations should work inclusive and they are striving towards a world that is more socially just. And that's exactly what my principles are founded on as well. So I think in any kind of struggle that you might encounter, and we have, that happens because that's what collaboration is about, you take a step back and you remember that. And also the agreement that Anita mentioned is very helpful to guide you through any kind of difficulties that you might encounter. But the principle of sitting back and listening and thinking what the other party wants and how you can achieve that together, I think that's the most important one, and that's what's guiding us through this. In terms of approaching NGOs and how did I actually convince them? So in this case, actually, if I can say that, I don't even know if Anita knows this, but Goal was the third organization that I approached with this proposal. So we were under a lot of time pressure because I heard about this Caroline call quite late. Plus it was end of July and the deadline was 6th of September, which was a very narrow time space to write this, given that so many people are on holiday. And the writing in itself was fine, but I needed to find a partner, and that was the tricky part. So we approached two others. The first one took 2 or 3 weeks to get back to us, made us lose a lot of time. It was just on email through personal contacts that my mentor Sharon O'Brien had. And in the end, they said no, because they were going through some internal restructuring, very typical, I think, of NGOs. And they were overburdened by that. They couldn't handle just filling the form at that time. The second organization I approached, they were very quick to say no because they already had 2 Caroline Fellows, because I was part of the third call in this scheme and they had been successful with other applicants, so they said no. And then the third organization I approached was Goal. And I think it's a matter of luck as well that the person you are sending the email to sees something in the project. So we just wrote a very brief guiding email saying that the project would be focusing on translation. Here's some guiding material. I had made a document that briefly summarized the focus, the research questions, and then I had put benefits for Goal to get involved in this collaboration. So it would be things like guidance on practice and policy about translation, access to my network of other NGOs that I have worked with, access to events that I'll be organizing, and so on. And that I think was really helpful as well. So then they said yes, and we took it from there. Another challenge to that, I would say, is that between putting in the proposal and getting the grant and starting it, there was nearly a year of time. And the 2 people who were going to be my mentoring Goal, one in headquarters and someone else in the country office, they were no longer there. So I arrived, and then already you have to start again because the people I was working with were not the people I originally thought I would be working with. Luckily, Anita did get the point about the research, and it's been a fruitful collaboration, but it did take time as well to establish that trust. And I would also say I planned 6 months in headquarters, and if I could go back and write the proposal again, I would make it longer, because I think the first few months you are just busy making that relationship work rather than really doing research.
Thanks a lot. Interesting behind the scenes glance into projects. I might just combine a few other questions and see if we can get through them. One question is related to kind of good practices in international NGOs. So if either of you have come across cases that you would consider a good practice in terms of organisations reaching communities in their languages. And related to that, do you think that these are a change in relation? Do you think that any practice is changing in relation to the status of translation? Is there any evidence that that's already happening from the work that you've done?
Okay, so good practice example, the one that comes to mind is the work that Tear Fund has done, which we've come across in the listening zones research, as they were one of the organizations that we were working with. So they have been translating a lot of their materials on, for example, agricultural information and so on into local languages. They have a web space called the Tilt's Learning Zone or something along those lines, where they have documents in, I can't even remember, 50 languages or so. They really invite the people that they work with in the different countries to produce their own translations and to send them in. And they provide basic guidelines on how to best produce a translation like that. Something else that Tear Fund has done that really impressed us, and that there's really kind of been the inspiration of using the phrase translation as empowerment, is that they ran workshops in a number of different countries where they got the communities involved in translating specific health-related agricultural information. So they set up a system where you would have 10 people or so in a workshop together translating, and then they would assign someone the task of being the proofreader and the editor, managing everything and so on. And for people, it was described to us in interviews by Tear Fund staff as a very empowering experience to people, because it made them value their language. They could see that their language could be used to talk about these sorts of issues, and it gave it more strength, so to speak. And it gave them more ownership of the material as well, because they could translate it in a way that made sense to them. So they are definitely a good practice example. Is anything changing? We have had several emails from organizations we've worked with. Again, I'm talking about the Listening Zones project. So both from the 4 NGOs that we worked with, as well as some of the partner organizations that we interviewed in Malawi, Peru, and Kyrgyzstan. We shared our report with findings with them and so on. And some of them have responded to us saying that they had made changes to their policy or to the way that they were doing things internally. So that is really good to see. And I'm sure that in Goal as well, even though this might not lead to an official policy, I'm not even sure that that would be the most useful, because a policy is a piece of paper and it doesn't mean that anything is changing in practice. And I think what's more important is that colleagues are really talking about this right now. And I'm sure that that's going to be something that sticks with Goal after I leave. And that's really good to see.
Yeah, I mean, when I see there's a question here, do I for me, around non-mentioning of languages, in the AI NGOs. I think that's true. Yeah, I say that until I met them. I hadn't heard them because this is important. Or you just take it for granted, I suppose. And I say this actually even today. That then now I discover there is discipline about this. All of you, with an interest on that. So that's fantastic. But even and this actually, first of all, to say 2 things. One is that this is about, as I speak to the earlier discussion about how you convince your partner. So I mean, Goal had committed to this anyway when I came in. So I was, we had agreed that I was going to be the mentoring of those two these people that had left. So Mina and I had the first meeting, and I have to say, and she knows, I was very skeptical about this, even though of course we had committed to it, so it was going to go ahead. But once we had that one meeting, she made her case, and I really was very interested. So it's about making your case and making your argument in a very, as it is, very, yes, authoritative way, and working at it, so it's kind of gain the interest, if you like, in the organization. And when I think
Anita, your sound is very bad at the moment. I don't know if anything changed.
My internet.
Okay, it sort of sounds a little bit like you're underwater, but previously it was really clear. I don't know. I think a couple of people commented on it as well.
Oh, so sorry. Okay. How about now?
What we could do is when we put the recording up on our website, we can sort of listen carefully and tidy up the transcript in that section, because from what I did hear, it sounded like it was very interesting. So it was a shame it was just slightly distorted.
Yeah, maybe just to say, because I know we're running out of time, that to that question, are things changing? I mean, I certainly see in our own organization that things are changing. The interest is increasing. But you have to work at, like Nina, for example, has done webinars, has spoken to people, and already she's creating demand. We have, staff who are saying that, we want more training on languages, staff saying that we should have a policy, staff saying we should have, translators on in-house. And I think these discussions will continue. So she has planted the seeds, if you like. So I think as I said, like Irina is very skeptical to this, myself, and obviously my views have changed, but I see a change even within our own organization. So not only will we have this piece of research, but I think the unintended possibly, positive consequences, I think will last. Which gives me hope that yes, things will change, because you get medium-sized organizations like ours, and you've got some other bigger organizations like Oxfam and the or Amnesty International, then these things do become a bit more mainstream and others follow.
Brilliant. Well, we're just after 1 o'clock now, so thanks for a really engaging question session, and brilliant questions and excellent answers. Our next talk for the series is going to be in a fortnight, on a Friday at 12 UK time again, so on the 31st of July, and we'll have Paul Kerswell and Margaret Ismaila, who are going to discuss an interdisciplinary project which combines environmental science, participatory theatre, social linguistics and development, and it focuses on artisanal and small-scale gold mining in Ghana. And you can register for that talk and see the other talks in the series on our website, multilingual-learning.com. And I think all that's left to do is to thank everyone once again for coming, and thanks to our speakers, Wina Tesur and Anita Friel, for a really wonderful session. And I hope everyone has a nice day and a lovely weekend, wherever you are. See you after.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for questions and for being here. Thanks for organizing, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.